Colonel Heinrich Müller stepped off the military transport plane at RAF Northolt, his polished boots clicking against the tarmac. The German NATO officer had arrived in London for what he believed would be a routine diplomatic visit. His chest displayed an impressive array of medals, each one telling a story of his rise through the ranks of the Bundeswehr. At 52 years old, Müller had commanded troops in Afghanistan, led peacekeeping missions in the Balkans, and earned respect across European military circles. But Heinrich Müller carried something else with him that day, a deep skepticism about British military traditions. In his mind, the pageantry and ceremony that surrounded institutions like the Queen's Guard represented everything wrong with modern European defense. While real soldiers fought in distant wars, these men in red coats and tall black hats played dress-up for tourists. He had seen the videos online, watched as guards stood motionless while people posed for photos, seemingly more concerned with looking pretty than being effective soldiers. His aide, Captain Weber, walked beside him carrying a thick briefing folder. The younger officer had tried to brief Müller about British military customs during the flight, but the colonel had waved him off dismissively. Müller believed in modern warfare, high-tech equipment, and practical uniforms designed for combat effectiveness. The idea that serious military personnel would waste time in ceremonial duties struck him as outdated and foolish. The black government car that waited for them moved smoothly through London traffic toward their hotel near Hyde Park. Müller gazed out the window at the bustling city, his mind already focused on the NATO planning sessions that would begin the next morning. These meetings would determine resource allocation for the alliance's Eastern European operations, and Müller intended to push for more practical military spending, rather than waste money on what he saw as theatrical nonsense. Their hotel sat just blocks away from Buckingham Palace, and Müller could already see tourists gathering with cameras and guidebooks. The sight reinforced his preconceptions about British military priorities. In his experience, effective soldiers focused on training, equipment, and mission readiness. They did not waste time standing perfectly still while civilians gawked at them like museum exhibits. That evening, Müller joined other NATO officials for dinner at a prestigious London club. The conversation naturally turned to various national military traditions, and several British officers spoke with obvious pride about the Queen's Guard and other ceremonial units. Air Marshal Pemberton, a distinguished RAF veteran, explained how these traditions connected modern forces to centuries of military heritage. Müller listened politely but found himself growing increasingly irritated. When asked about his opinion, he decided to speak frankly. These ceremonial guards might look impressive to tourists, he suggested, but they represented a fundamental misallocation of military resources. Real soldiers should be training for actual combat scenarios, not learning how to march in perfect synchronization while wearing impractical uniforms. The British officers exchanged subtle glances, but remained diplomatic in their responses. They explained that members of the Queen's Guard were active-duty soldiers from elite infantry regiments, including units like the Grenadier Guards and Coldstream Guards. These men served operational tours in combat zones between their ceremonial duties. The discipline required for ceremonial drill actually enhanced their effectiveness as combat soldiers. Müller remained unconvinced. He had commanded troops in real combat situations, and he knew what effective military discipline looked like. Standing motionless for hours while tourists took photographs had nothing to do with battlefield readiness. The conversation moved to other topics, but Müller's opinions had been clearly stated. After dinner, several colleagues suggested a walking tour of nearby Westminster to see some of London's famous landmarks. As they strolled through the illuminated streets, Müller found himself studying the architecture and history around him. London certainly possessed impressive historical significance, and he could appreciate the cultural importance of maintaining certain traditions. But military effectiveness remained his primary concern. In his view, modern armed forces faced serious threats that required constant adaptation and improvement. Resources spent on ceremonial duties could be better invested in advanced training, modern equipment, or enhanced readiness capabilities. The parade ground belonged in museums, not in contemporary military operations. Captain Weber, walking slightly behind his superior, had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Müller's outspoken criticism of British military traditions. The young officer understood the importance of diplomatic relationships within NATO, and he worried that his colonel's comments might create unnecessary friction with their British counterparts. As they returned to their hotel, Muller outlined his plans for the following day. After the morning NATO sessions, he intended to take a brief tour of some London military sites. This would give him an opportunity to observe British military operations firsthand, and perhaps gather evidence to support his arguments. About resource allocation priorities, Weber suggested they might want to maintain a more diplomatic approach, especially given the sensitive nature of their mission. The NATO meetings would address several contentious issues, and maintaining positive relationships with British military leadership could prove crucial for achieving their objectives. Muller appreciated his aide's diplomatic instincts, but he had no intention of moderating his views to avoid uncomfortable conversations. Military effectiveness was too important for political correctness. If British forces were wasting valuable resources on outdated ceremonial functions, someone needed to point this out clearly and directly. The hotel room overlooked Hyde Park Corner, and Muller could see Wellington Arch illuminated against the night sky. The monument commemorated the Duke of Wellington's victories over Napoleon, representing a time when British military power had genuinely influenced world events. But those days were long past, and modern military forces needed to adapt to contemporary realities. As he prepared for bed, Muller reviewed his notes for the next day's meetings. The agenda included discussions about joint training exercises, equipment standardization, and budget allocations. He intended to use these sessions to advocate for practical military investments rather than ceremonial expenses. His final thoughts before sleep centered on the disconnect he perceived between military tradition and military effectiveness. Tomorrow would provide opportunities to observe British military operations more closely, and he expected these observations would confirm his suspicions about misplaced priorities. The Queen's Guard represented everything he believed was wrong with European military thinking. Too much emphasis on appearance, not enough focus on substance. Muller fell asleep confident in his assessment, completely unaware that the next day would challenge every assumption he had made about British military discipline and the true nature of the soldiers who wore those distinctive red uniforms. The morning NATO briefing sessions proceeded as Colonel Muller had expected. Technical discussions about equipment procurement, joint training protocols, and operational readiness consumed most of the morning hours. Muller contributed his expertise on several topics, particularly regarding the German military's experience with modern battlefield communication systems. During a coffee break, he found himself in conversation with Lieutenant Colonel James Hartwell of the British Army. Hartwell commanded a battalion within the Household Division, the organization responsible for providing the Queen's Guard. The British officer was younger than Muller, perhaps 40 years old, but carried himself with quiet confidence that suggested extensive combat experience. Their conversation began with routine military topics, shared experiences in Afghanistan, challenges of modern military logistics, and the evolving nature of NATO cooperation. But Muller couldn't resist steering the discussion toward his primary area of interest. He asked Hartwell directly about the practical value of ceremonial duties in modern military training. Hartwell's response surprised Muller with its thoughtful complexity. The lieutenant colonel explained that ceremonial drill served as an advanced form of discipline training that enhanced soldiers' ability to perform under pressure. The precision required for public ceremonies translated directly into improved performance in combat situations, where exact timing and coordination could mean the difference between life and death. Muller remained skeptical. In his experience, combat effectiveness came from realistic training scenarios that replicated actual battlefield conditions. Standing perfectly still while tourists took photographs bore no resemblance to the dynamic, chaotic environment of modern warfare. He expressed these views diplomatically but clearly. Hartwell listened carefully before responding. He suggested that Muller might benefit from observing the Queen's Guard training personally. Most civilians only saw the final product, soldiers standing at attention during public ceremonies. They never witnessed the intensive preparation, the rigorous selection process, or the advanced training that produced such extraordinary discipline. The suggestion intrigued Muller despite his skepticism. Scientific observation had always been his preferred method for evaluating military effectiveness. If he could study the Queen's Guard training process directly, he would gather concrete evidence to support his arguments about resource allocation priorities. Hartwell offered to arrange a private observation session that afternoon, after the NATO meetings concluded. This would give Muller an opportunity to see behind the ceremonial facade and understand the actual training methods used to prepare these soldiers. Muller accepted immediately, confident that first-hand observation would confirm his assumptions about wasted military resources. The afternoon session was scheduled for Wellington Barracks, located just behind Buckingham Palace. This facility served as headquarters for several household division regiments and contained training areas specifically designed for ceremonial drill preparation. Hartwell explained that Muller would observe both individual training and unit coordination exercises. Captain Weber accompanied his colonel to the barracks, carrying his usual collection of notebooks and observation materials. The young aide had researched British military traditions during lunch and felt increasingly concerned about his superior's confrontational approach. The Queen's Guard represented one of Britain's most respected military institutions, and criticizing them directly could create lasting diplomatic problems. Wellington Barracks impressed Muller with its efficient organization and professional atmosphere. The facility combined historical architecture with modern training equipment, creating an environment that balanced tradition with practical military requirements. Soldiers moved through the complex with purposeful energy that suggested serious military activity rather than mere pageantry. Hartwell led them to an observation area overlooking a large drill square where individual soldiers practiced ceremonial movements. Muller immediately noticed the intense concentration on each man's face as they repeated complex sequences of movements with mechanical precision. Every step, every turn, every position of the rifle was executed with absolute exactness. The first soldier they observed was Guardsman Thompson, a 24-year-old veteran of 2 operational tours in Afghanistan. Hartwell quietly provided background information as they watched Thompson practice his drill sequences. The young soldier had joined the Guards after serving with distinction in combat operations, specifically requesting assignment to the Queen's Guard because of its reputation for excellence. Muller studied Thompson's movements carefully, applying his professional expertise to evaluate what he was seeing. The soldier's posture demonstrated exceptional physical conditioning and mental focus. Each movement flowed smoothly into the next with mechanical precision that suggested hundreds of hours of practice. But Muller still questioned whether this training produced skills relevant to modern combat situations. Hartwell suggested they observe a unit coordination exercise that would demonstrate how individual discipline contributed to collective effectiveness. 24 guardsmen formed up in precise formation, their red uniforms and bearskin hats creating an impressive visual display. But Muller forced himself to look beyond the ceremonial appearance and focus on the underlying military skills being demonstrated. The unit commander issued a series of complex drill commands that required instant response and perfect coordination from every member of the formation. Muller watched as 24 men moved as a single entity, executing intricate maneuvers that demanded split-second timing and absolute trust in their comrades' abilities. The precision was undeniably impressive, but Muller remained focused on practical applications. He asked Hartwell to explain how these ceremonial skills translated into combat effectiveness. The British officer's answer surprised him with its detailed analysis of the psychological and physical benefits of extreme discipline training. According to Hartwell, the mental control required for ceremonial drill enhanced soldiers' ability to maintain composure under the stress of combat operations. Men who could stand motionless for hours in front of crowds possessed the self-discipline necessary to maintain firing positions under enemy fire. The coordination required for complex drill movements improved unit cohesion and communication. In battlefield situations, Muller found these explanations theoretically interesting but remained unconvinced about practical applications. Real combat situations were unpredictable and chaotic, requiring rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. The rigid precision of ceremonial drill seemed to emphasize conformity over the creative thinking necessary for effective battlefield leadership. Weber, observing from nearby, noticed that several other British officers had joined them as observers. Word had apparently spread about the German colonel's visit, and there seemed to be considerable interest in his evaluation of their training methods. The young aide worried that his superior's skepticism might be creating an uncomfortable situation. As the afternoon progressed, Muller's observations confirmed some of his initial assumptions while challenging others. The soldiers clearly possessed exceptional discipline and physical conditioning. Their ability to execute complex movements with perfect precision demonstrated remarkable training and dedication, but he still questioned whether the time and resources invested in ceremonial training could be better allocated to more practical military skills. Hartwell seemed to sense Muller's continued skepticism and suggested they observe one final exercise that might address his concerns more directly. This demonstration would show how ceremonial, discipline training connected to actual combat skills through a specialized exercise that combined drill precision with tactical movement. Muller agreed to observe this final demonstration, though he remained confident in his overall assessment. Nothing he had seen changed his fundamental belief that modern military forces should prioritize practical combat training over ceremonial pageantry. Tomorrow's schedule would provide additional opportunities to test his theories about British military effectiveness through more direct observation. The final demonstration that Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell arranged took place in a specialized training area that Muller had not seen before. This facility combined traditional drill squares with modern tactical training equipment, creating an environment where ceremonial precision could be tested against practical military challenges. 8 guardsmen formed up in ceremonial formation, their red uniforms pristine and their bearing perfect. But Muller noticed immediately that their rifles were not the ceremonial weapons typically associated with palace guard duties. Instead, each man carried a modern SA-80 assault rifle, the standard combat weapon of the British Army. Hartwell explained that this exercise would demonstrate how the discipline developed through ceremonial training enhanced performance in tactical situations. The guardsmen would execute a series of movements that began with traditional drill commands, but evolved into practical combat maneuvers. Muller would see firsthand how ceremonial precision translated into battlefield effectiveness. The exercise began conventionally enough. The unit commander issued standard drill commands, and the 8 soldiers responded with the mechanical precision that Muller had observed throughout the afternoon. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, each man maintaining exact positioning relative to his comrades while executing complex weapon handling procedures. But then the exercise shifted dramatically. Simulated enemy contact was announced through the training facility's communication system, and the formation instantly transformed from ceremonial display into tactical deployment. The same men who had been marching in perfect unison suddenly became a coordinated combat unit, taking cover positions and establishing fields of fire with remarkable speed and efficiency. Muller watched intently as the soldiers moved through a series of tactical scenarios designed to test their ability to maintain unit cohesion under simulated combat stress. Live ammunition was not used, but laser training systems provided realistic feedback about accuracy and tactical effectiveness. The guardsman's performance was genuinely impressive. What struck Muller most forcefully was the seamless transition between ceremonial precision and tactical competence. The same mental discipline that enabled perfect drill performance seemed to enhance the soldiers' ability to execute complex tactical maneuvers under pressure. Their movements remained coordinated and purposeful, even as they adapted to rapidly changing simulated battlefield conditions. Sergeant Williams, one of the participating soldiers, had served 3 operational tours in Afghanistan before joining the Queen's Guard. During a brief break in the exercise, Hartwell arranged for Muller to speak with him directly about his experiences combining ceremonial duties with combat operations. Williams explained that the discipline required for Queen's Guard duties had actually improved his effectiveness as a combat soldier. The mental control necessary to stand motionless for hours in front of crowds translated directly into improved ability to maintain firing positions under enemy fire. The precision required for ceremonial weapon handling enhanced his marksmanship and tactical weapon employment. Muller asked Williams specifically about the practical value of ceremonial training compared to conventional combat preparation. The sergeant's answer revealed a sophisticated understanding of how different types of military training reinforced each other. Ceremonial drill developed mental discipline and attention to detail that enhanced performance in all military activities. According to Williams, many soldiers initially viewed ceremonial duties as a distraction from real military work. But combat veterans who had served with the Queen's Guard consistently reported that the experience had made them better soldiers overall. The extreme standards of dress, deportment, and performance required for ceremonial duties raised their expectations for excellence in all military activities. Captain Weber, observing these conversations carefully, noticed that his colonel's attitude seemed to be shifting subtly. Muller continued asking probing questions, but his tone had become more genuinely curious and less dismissive. The German officer was clearly seeing aspects of British military training that challenged his initial assumptions. The exercise continued, with increasingly complex scenarios that tested the soldiers' ability to maintain unit coordination while adapting to dynamic tactical situations. Muller observed how the same men who had demonstrated perfect ceremonial precision adapted smoothly to simulated urban combat, convoy escort duties, and defensive operations. One particularly impressive sequence demonstrated how ceremonial drill movements could be modified for tactical applications. The precise footwork and positioning skills developed through hours of parade ground practice translated directly into improved movement techniques for room clearing and urban combat operations. Hartwell pointed out that the Queen's Guard selection process ensured that only the most capable soldiers were chosen for these duties. Men had to demonstrate exceptional performance in combat training, physical fitness, and military knowledge before being considered for ceremonial assignments. The Queen's Guard represented the elite of British infantry forces, not a separate category of decorative soldiers. This information surprised Muller considerably. His mental model of ceremonial guards had assumed they were selected primarily for physical appearance and willingness to participate in pageantry. Learning that Queen's Guard assignments required demonstrated combat competence forced him to reconsider his basic assumptions about British military priorities. As the demonstration concluded, Muller found himself genuinely impressed by what he had observed. The soldiers had demonstrated tactical competence that matched or exceeded standards he expected from his own units. Their ability to maintain perfect coordination under simulated stress suggested a level of discipline and training that could not be dismissed as mere showmanship. Weber approached his colonel as they prepared to leave the training facility. The young aide had observed the afternoon's events carefully and sensed that Muller's perspective was evolving in unexpected directions. The British soldiers had clearly made a strong impression through their combination of ceremonial precision and tactical competence. Hartwell offered to arrange additional observations the following day, including an opportunity to witness the Queen's Guard performing their actual ceremonial duties at Buckingham Palace. This would give Muller a chance to see how the training he had observed translated into the public ceremonies that attracted millions of tourists annually. Muller accepted the invitation immediately. His scientific approach to military evaluation required comprehensive observation before reaching final conclusions. While the afternoon's demonstrations had challenged some of his assumptions, he wanted to observe the complete cycle of Queen's Guard activities before forming definitive judgments. That evening, Muller returned to his hotel with considerably more questions than answers. The soldiers he had observed clearly possessed impressive military capabilities that extended far beyond ceremonial appearance. Their ability to transition seamlessly between drill precision and tactical competence suggested a training system more sophisticated than he had initially assumed. But fundamental questions remained about resource allocation and military priorities. Even if ceremonial training produced genuine military benefits, was it the most efficient use of elite soldiers' time and capabilities? Could equivalent discipline and tactical competence be developed through more conventional training methods that did not require elaborate ceremonial pageantry? Muller spent the evening reviewing his observations and preparing questions for the next day's activities. Tomorrow would provide the final piece of evidence he needed to evaluate the Queen's Guard system comprehensively. He would observe these soldiers performing their actual ceremonial duties and assess whether public performance maintained the same standards of excellence he had witnessed in training. Colonel Muller arrived at Buckingham Palace early the next morning, determined to observe the Queen's Guard performing their actual ceremonial duties. Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell had arranged special access that would allow Mueller to position himself close to the guards posts and study their behavior during active duty periods. The morning was crisp and clear, with hundreds of tourists already gathering along the palace railings despite the early hour. Mueller noticed how the crowd's anticipation seemed to build as guard positions were established and ceremonial preparations began. For these visitors, the Queen's Guard represented a living connection to British history and tradition. Mueller positioned himself where he could observe the guards' faces and body language, without interfering with their duties. His military experience had taught him that a soldier's demeanor revealed much about their training, discipline, and professional competence. He intended to study these men as carefully as he would evaluate any military unit under his command. The first guard he observed was Guardsman Patterson, a tall soldier whose red uniform and bearskin hat created an imposing presence. Patterson stood at attention with such perfect stillness that he seemed almost like a statue, his eyes fixed straight ahead and his breathing so controlled that his chest barely moved. Mueller began timing Patterson's period of motionless attention, curious about how long the soldier could maintain such perfect posture. Minutes passed without any visible movement or change in expression. The guard's face remained completely impassive, despite the growing crowd of tourists who pressed close to the railings and pointed cameras in his direction. After 30 minutes of observation, Mueller was genuinely impressed by Patterson's level of self-control. The soldier had not shifted his weight, adjusted his grip on his rifle, or shown any acknowledgement of the crowd's presence. This degree of mental discipline exceeded anything Mueller had seen in his own units. Even among soldiers he considered exceptionally well trained. Captain Weber joined his colonel for these observations, notebook ready to record details that might prove relevant to their final assessment. The young aide had researched Queen's Guard protocols extensively and was prepared to explain the regulations and traditions governing their behavior. According to Weber's research, guards were required to maintain their positions for specific time periods regardless of weather conditions, crowd behavior, or personal discomfort. They could not acknowledge tourist interactions, respond to questions, or react to attempts to provoke them. This level of self-discipline was maintained throughout their duty shifts, which could last several hours. Mueller decided to test the limits of this discipline through careful observation. He positioned himself where he could study the guards' reactions to various external stimuli, without violating palace security protocols. What he discovered challenged his assumptions about the nature of military self-control. A group of teenage tourists began taking increasingly elaborate photographs near Patterson's position, posing in exaggerated positions and making loud comments designed to provoke a reaction. The guard maintained perfect composure, his expression unchanging despite the obvious attempts to distract him. One particularly persistent tourist actually stepped slightly across the designated boundary line, prompting immediate response from palace security personnel, but Patterson himself showed no reaction whatsoever, maintaining his exact position and demeanor as if nothing had happened. Mueller recognized this as extraordinary, self-discipline that would be invaluable in combat, situations where maintaining position under fire could be critical. The test became more challenging when a small child accidentally dropped a toy that rolled near Patterson's feet. The natural human impulse would be to glance down or acknowledge the child's distress, but the guard maintained his forward gaze without any visible reaction. Security personnel quickly retrieved the toy and returned it to the child, but Patterson had remained completely focused on his duties. Mueller found himself genuinely amazed by this level of mental control. In his experience, even the most disciplined soldiers would show some reaction to unexpected events occurring in their immediate vicinity. The ability to maintain complete focus despite significant external distractions suggested training that went far beyond conventional military preparation. Hartwell appeared beside Mueller as he continued his observations. The British officer had been monitoring the German colonel's reactions carefully, understanding that this evaluation could influence future NATO cooperation and resource allocation decisions. He was pleased to see Mueller's obvious surprise at the guard's performance. Mueller asked Hartwell directly about the training methods used to develop such extraordinary self-discipline. How did the British military transform ordinary soldiers into men capable of such perfect mental control? What specific techniques produced this level of concentration and composure? Hartwell's explanation revealed a training system more rigorous and comprehensive than Mueller had imagined. Prospective Queen's Guard members underwent months of specialized preparation that combined physical conditioning, mental discipline training, and intensive practice of ceremonial procedures. Only soldiers who demonstrated exceptional self-control and attention to detail were selected for these positions. The training included exercises specifically designed to test mental resilience under pressure. Soldiers practiced maintaining perfect composure, while instructors attempted to distract them through various means. They learned to control their breathing, manage physical discomfort, and maintain focus despite fatigue or external stimulation. Mueller began to understand that what he was observing represented the culmination of an advanced training system rather than simple pageantry. The Guards' ability to maintain perfect discipline in public represented the same mental skills that would enable them to perform effectively under the stress of combat operations. A changing of the guard ceremony was scheduled for mid-morning, and Hartwell suggested they observe this ritual to see how individual discipline translated into unit coordination. Mueller agreed, curious to see whether the precision he had witnessed in training would be maintained during actual ceremonial performance. The ceremony began with the arrival of the relief guard, 24 soldiers marching in perfect formation across the palace forecourt. Their movements were synchronized with mechanical precision, each man maintaining exact positioning relative to his comrades while executing complex drill sequences. Mueller studied the ceremony with his professional expertise, evaluating it as he would any military operation under his command. The coordination required for such precise movement demanded extensive practice and exceptional individual discipline. Any soldier who failed to maintain his part would disrupt the entire formation. As the ceremony progressed, Mueller observed how the guards maintained their composure, despite the presence of hundreds of tourists, multiple cameras, and the pressure of performing before an international audience. Their faces remained impassive, and their movements stayed perfectly coordinated throughout the complex sequence of ceremonial procedures. One particular moment tested the guards' discipline severely. A tourist's camera flash malfunctioned, creating a rapid series of bright flashes directly in front of the formation. Several visitors pointed and laughed at the technical problem, but the guards showed no reaction whatsoever. They continued their ceremonial sequence without any acknowledgement of the distraction. Mueller realized he was witnessing something remarkable. These soldiers possessed a level of mental discipline that exceeded anything in his own experience. Their ability to maintain perfect focus and coordination despite significant external pressure suggested training methods that produced genuine military advantages. Captain Weber, observing his colonel's reactions carefully, noticed that Mueller's body language had changed significantly since the beginning of their observation period. The German officer was no longer watching with skeptical detachment, but with genuine professional interest and growing respect for what he was seeing. As the changing of the guard ceremony concluded, Mueller found himself forced to reconsider his basic assumptions about the Queen's Guard system. What he had initially dismissed as elaborate pageantry was revealing itself to be an advanced form of military training that produced measurable benefits in soldier discipline and unit coordination. Colonel Mueller's confidence in his initial assessment began to crack as he continued observing the Queen's Guard throughout the morning. What had started as a routine evaluation to confirm his assumptions about wasted military resources was evolving into something much more challenging to his professional worldview. After the changing of the guard ceremony, Hartwell arranged for Mueller to observe the guards during their less visible duties. Most tourists only saw the public ceremonies and sentry posts, but the Queen's Guard performed numerous security and administrative functions that required the same level of precision and discipline. They moved to an observation point where Mueller could watch guards conducting security patrols around the palace perimeter. These soldiers moved with purposeful efficiency, their eyes constantly scanning for potential threats while maintaining the perfect bearing that characterized all their activities. Mueller noticed how their ceremonial training translated into enhanced situational awareness and tactical positioning. Guardsman Roberts, one of the soldiers Mueller observed during patrol duties, had completed 3 operational tours in Afghanistan before joining the Queen's Guard. His movement patterns and threat assessment procedures reflected genuine combat experience combined with the enhanced discipline developed through ceremonial training. Muller asked Hartwell to arrange a brief conversation with Roberts during a scheduled break period. The German colonel wanted to understand how combat veterans viewed the relationship between ceremonial duties and military effectiveness. Roberts' insights might help resolve the apparent contradiction between his initial assumptions and his current observations. Roberts explained that his Queen's Guard service had actually improved his effectiveness as a combat soldier. The mental discipline required for ceremonial duties enhanced his ability to maintain focus during long security operations. The precision demanded by drill training improved his attention to detail in tactical situations where small mistakes could have serious consequences. According to Roberts, many soldiers initially viewed Queen's Guard assignment as a break from real military duties. But combat veterans consistently discovered that the experience enhanced their overall military capabilities. The extreme standards required for ceremonial performance raised their expectations for excellence in all military activities. Muller found Roberts's perspective particularly credible because of his extensive combat experience. This was not a theoretical discussion about training methods but practical analysis from a soldier who had tested both conventional military training and Queen's Guard preparation in actual operational environments. Captain Weber, listening to these conversations carefully, noticed that his colonel was asking increasingly detailed questions about specific training methods and selection criteria. Muller's tone had shifted from skeptical inquiry to genuine, professional interest in understanding how the British system produced such impressive results. Hartwell suggested they observe one final aspect of Queen's Guard operations that might address Muller's remaining concerns about resource allocation. The afternoon would include a demonstration of how ceremonial skills transferred to modern security operations, including counterterrorism procedures and crowd control techniques. This demonstration took place at a secure training facility where guards practiced responses to various security threats. Muller watched as soldiers who had demonstrated perfect ceremonial precision adapted their skills to realistic security scenarios involving suspicious packages, unauthorized intrusions, and crowd disturbances. The same mental discipline that enabled guards to stand motionless for hours proved invaluable when maintaining security perimeters under pressure. Their ability to remain calm and focused while following precise procedures enhanced their effectiveness in situations where emotional reactions could escalate dangerous confrontations. Mueller observed a particularly impressive exercise where guards had to maintain crowd control while processing security alerts through radio communications. The soldiers demonstrated remarkable ability to manage multiple complex tasks simultaneously while maintaining perfect composure under simulated stress conditions. Sergeant Mitchell, who led this demonstration, had served with distinction in Iraq before joining the Queen's Guard. He explained how ceremonial training had enhanced his ability to compartmentalize information and maintain focus during complex military operations. The mental skills developed through drill practice translated directly into improved performance in high-stress tactical situations. As the afternoon progressed, Muller found his professional skepticism increasingly difficult to maintain. Every aspect of Queen's Guard operations that he observed revealed sophisticated training methods that produced measurable military benefits. His initial assumptions about wasted resources were being systematically challenged by concrete evidence of enhanced soldier capabilities. Weber approached his colonel as the demonstration concluded, sensing that Muller was struggling to reconcile his observations with his preconceived notions about ceremonial military duties. The young aide had watched his superior's confidence in his initial assessment gradually erode throughout the day. Mueller requested a private meeting with Hartwell to discuss his observations more frankly. The German colonel needed to understand how his professional evaluation of the Queen's Guard would affect his recommendations about NATO resource allocation and military cooperation priorities. Hartwell led Mueller to a quiet office where they could speak without interruption. The British officer had observed Mueller's evolving reactions throughout the day and understood that the German colonel was experiencing a significant shift in his understanding of British military methods. Mueller began by acknowledging that his observations had challenged several of his initial assumptions about the Queen's Guard system. The soldiers he had observed clearly possessed exceptional discipline and tactical competence that exceeded many conventional military standards. Their ability to maintain perfect coordination under pressure suggested training methods that produced genuine military advantages. However, Mueller still questioned whether the resources invested in ceremonial training could be more efficiently allocated to conventional military preparation. Even if Queen's Guard service enhanced soldier capabilities, would equivalent benefits be achieved through more direct training methods that did not require elaborate ceremonial pageantry? Hartwell's response revealed the depth of analysis that had gone into developing the Queen's Guard training system. British military leadership had extensively studied the relationship between ceremonial discipline and combat effectiveness, conducting formal assessments that documented measurable improvements in soldier performance. According to Hartwell, soldiers who completed Queen's Guard service consistently outperformed their peers in subsequent military evaluations. Their enhanced discipline, attention to detail, and ability to perform under pressure translated into superior performance in combat training, leadership development, and specialized military assignments. The conversation continued for nearly an hour as Mueller explored various aspects of the Queen's Guard system that had surprised him. Hartwell provided detailed explanations of selection criteria, training methods, and performance standards that revealed a level of sophistication that Mueller had not anticipated. As their meeting concluded, Mueller realized that his evaluation mission had produced results completely contrary to his expectations. Instead of gathering evidence to support arguments against ceremonial military spending, he had discovered a training system that enhanced soldier capabilities in measurable ways. Captain Weber was waiting outside when Mueller emerged from his meeting with Hartwell. The young aide immediately recognized that his colonel's perspective had undergone a fundamental transformation. Mueller's body language and demeanor reflected genuine respect for what he had observed, rather than the dismissive skepticism that had characterized his initial approach. Mueller informed Weber that they would need to significantly revise their assessment of British military training methods. The Queen's Guard system represented an innovative approach to developing military discipline that produced results superior to many conventional training programs. This discovery would require careful consideration in their final recommendations about NATO cooperation and resource allocation priorities. The evening of Colonel Mueller's second day in London found him in an unexpected position. Instead of preparing a critical assessment of British military resource allocation, he was drafting notes about innovative training methods that challenged his fundamental assumptions about military effectiveness. Mueller sat in his hotel room overlooking Hyde Park Corner, struggling to reconcile what he had observed with his professional experience and theoretical knowledge. The Queen's Guard had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded his expectations in every measurable category. Their discipline, tactical competence, and mental resilience suggested training methods that produced genuine military advantages. Captain Weber worked quietly at the desk nearby, organizing the detailed observations they had recorded throughout their evaluation period. The young aide had documented specific examples of enhanced soldier performance that would support whatever conclusions Mueller reached about the Queen's Guard system. But Weber was also concerned about the dramatic shift in his colonel's perspective. Mueller had arrived in London with firm convictions about military priorities and resource allocation. The possibility that these convictions might be fundamentally wrong created professional and personal challenges that extended beyond their current mission. A knock at the door interrupted Mueller's contemplation. Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell had arrived for what both men understood would be their final substantive discussion about the Queen's Guard evaluation. This conversation would determine how Mueller's observations translated into formal recommendations about NATO cooperation and military resource allocation. Hartwell entered carrying a thick folder containing additional documentation about Queen's Guard training methods and performance metrics. He had prepared comprehensive data that would help Mueller understand the complete scope of the program and its measurable benefits for British military effectiveness. The British officer settled into a chair across from Mueller, understanding that this conversation would be crucial for future NATO relationships. Mueller's evaluation would influence German military leadership's perspective on British training methods and could affect resource allocation decisions across the alliance. Mueller began by acknowledging the professional challenge his observations had created. As a career military officer, he had developed strong convictions about effective training methods based on extensive combat experience and theoretical study. The Queen's Guard system contradicted many of his fundamental assumptions about military priorities. However, scientific objectivity required him to evaluate evidence honestly, regardless of personal preferences or preconceived notions. The soldiers he had observed demonstrated capabilities that exceeded conventional military standards in multiple categories. Their performance suggested training methods that produced measurable advantages in military effectiveness. Hartwell appreciated Mueller's intellectual honesty and professional integrity. Many foreign observers approached the Queen's Guard with fixed assumptions that prevented objective evaluation. Mueller's willingness to reconsider his initial assessment demonstrated the scientific approach that distinguished exceptional military leaders. The conversation turned to specific performance metrics that documented Queen's Guard effectiveness. Hartwell showed Mueller formal studies comparing soldiers who had completed ceremonial service with control groups who had received only conventional military training. The data revealed consistent advantages in discipline, attention to detail, and performance under pressure. These studies had been conducted by independent military research organizations using standardized evaluation criteria. The results showed that Queen's Guard veterans outperformed their peers in subsequent military assignments by statistically significant margins. The ceremonial training produced genuine improvements in soldier capabilities that persisted throughout their military careers. Mueller studied the documentation carefully, applying his analytical skills to evaluate the research methodology and statistical validity. The studies appeared to be well-designed and properly executed, with sample sizes and control procedures that supported their conclusions. The evidence for Queen's Guard effectiveness was stronger than he had anticipated. One particularly impressive study tracked soldiers through complete military careers, documenting their performance in various assignments including combat operations, staff positions, and leadership roles. Queen's Guard veterans consistently received higher performance evaluations and achieved promotion to senior positions at rates significantly above military averages. The data also revealed interesting insights about the psychological benefits of ceremonial training. Soldiers who completed Queen's Guard service reported higher levels of confidence, job satisfaction, and commitment to military careers. The challenging nature of ceremonial duties seemed to enhance their sense of professional accomplishment and military identity. Mueller asked Hartwell about the broader implications of these findings for military training philosophy. If ceremonial discipline produced measurable benefits for soldier development, should other military organizations consider incorporating similar methods into their training programs? Hartwell's response revealed the complexity of implementing ceremonial training in different military contexts. The Queen's Guard system had evolved over centuries, incorporating cultural and historical elements that were uniquely British. Successful adaptation would require careful consideration of national military traditions and institutional capabilities. However, the underlying principles of precision, discipline, and mental resilience could be applied through various training methods adapted to different military cultures. The key was understanding how extreme standards of performance enhanced soldier capabilities rather than simply copying specific ceremonial procedures. The conversation continued past midnight as Mueller explored various aspects of military training philosophy that his observations had called into question. Hartwell provided detailed explanations of how ceremonial training connected to broader concepts of military effectiveness and professional development. Captain Weber participated occasionally in their discussion, but mostly observed the intellectual exchange between two experienced military leaders grappling with fundamental questions about soldier training and development. The young aide recognized that he was witnessing a significant evolution in his colonel's professional understanding. As their meeting concluded, Mueller realized that his evaluation mission had produced outcomes he never could have anticipated. Instead of confirming his assumptions about misallocated military resources, he had discovered innovative training methods that enhanced soldier capabilities in measurable ways. The implications extended far beyond simple assessment of British military practices. Miller's observations suggested that his own understanding of effective military training might be incomplete, requiring reconsideration of fundamental assumptions about soldier development and institutional priorities. Hartwell gathered his documentation as he prepared to leave, understanding that Muller would need time to process these discoveries and determine their implications for his formal recommendations. The German colonel's evaluation would influence NATO, cooperation and resource allocation decisions that could affect military effectiveness across the alliance. Mueller thanked Hartwell for his patience and professionalism throughout the evaluation process. The British officer had provided comprehensive access to Queen's Guard operations while maintaining diplomatic sensitivity about the potentially controversial nature of Muller's initial assumptions. As Hartwell departed, Muller and Weber began the challenging task of translating their observations into formal recommendations. The next day would bring final NATO meetings where Muller's assessment could influence alliance-wide decisions about military training priorities and resource allocation. But more immediately, Muller faced the personal challenge of acknowledging that his professional convictions had been fundamentally wrong. The Queen's Guard represented sophisticated military training rather than wasteful pageantry, producing enhanced soldier capabilities through methods he had not previously understood or appreciated. The final NATO meeting convened at 9 o'clock the following morning in a secure conference room overlooking the Thames. Colonel Muller entered with his assessment folder, knowing that his recommendations would influence alliance resource allocation decisions and potentially reshape German military leadership's understanding of training effectiveness. The meeting's agenda included presentations from various national representatives about innovative military training programs and their documented benefits. Muller's evaluation of British ceremonial training methods had been scheduled as a key presentation that would inform alliance-wide policy discussions. Air Marshal Pemberton, who had engaged Muller in dinner conversations several nights earlier, noticed the German colonel's subdued demeanor as he prepared his presentation materials. The change from Muller's confident skepticism to his current thoughtful uncertainty suggested that his evaluation had produced unexpected results. General Morrison, the senior British representative, introduced Muller's presentation with diplomatic language that acknowledged the sensitive nature of evaluating another nation's military traditions. The general emphasized that objective assessment of training effectiveness served the alliance's collective interests in developing the most capable military forces possible. Muller began his presentation by acknowledging that his evaluation had challenged several of his initial assumptions about ceremonial military training. Scientific objectivity required honest assessment of evidence, regardless of personal preferences or preconceived notions about military effectiveness. The presentation included detailed observations of Queen's Guard training methods, selection criteria, and performance standards. Muller described the sophisticated techniques used to develop extraordinary mental discipline and the measurable benefits these methods produced for soldier development. He presented the formal studies that documented Queen's Guard veterans' superior performance in subsequent military assignments. The statistical evidence showed consistent advantages in discipline, attention to detail, and effectiveness under pressure that persisted throughout military careers. The audience listened with growing attention as Muller described specific examples of enhanced soldier capabilities he had observed. His detailed analysis of how ceremonial precision translated into tactical competence challenged conventional assumptions about the relationship between tradition and military effectiveness. Captain Weber, sitting nearby, watched his colonel's presentation with mixed emotions. He was proud of Muller's intellectual honesty and professional integrity, but concerned about the implications for their future working relationship. His superior's public acknowledgement of being wrong about fundamental military principles created uncertain professional dynamics. Several alliance representatives asked detailed questions about the specific training methods Muller had observed. The French military attaché was particularly interested in whether ceremonial discipline techniques could be adapted to different national military traditions without losing their effectiveness. Muller's responses revealed the depth of analysis he had conducted during his evaluation. He had moved beyond simple observation to develop sophisticated understanding of how extreme performance standards enhanced soldier development through psychological and physiological mechanisms. The German colonel acknowledged that successful implementation of similar training methods would require careful adaptation to different military, cultures, and institutional capabilities. The Queen's Guard system had evolved over centuries within a unique historical and cultural context that could not be directly replicated elsewhere. However, the underlying principles of precision, mental discipline, and performance under pressure could be incorporated into various training programs adapted to different national requirements. The key was understanding how challenging standards enhanced soldier capabilities, rather than simply copying specific procedures. General Morrison asked Mueller directly about his recommendations for NATO training cooperation and resource allocation. This question went to the heart of the policy implications that had motivated the original evaluation mission. Mueller's answer surprised many attendees with its frank acknowledgement of his changed perspective. He recommended that NATO develop formal programs for sharing innovative training methods among alliance members, including comprehensive study of ceremonial discipline techniques and their applications to modern military requirements. He also suggested that alliance members reconsider their assumptions about the relationship between tradition and military effectiveness. Some traditional practices that appeared outdated might actually produce measurable benefits for soldier development that were not immediately obvious to conventional military analysis. The presentation concluded with Mueller's formal recommendation that NATO fund comprehensive research into advanced discipline training methods, including detailed study of the Queen's Guard system and similar programs in other alliance nations. This research could identify techniques that enhanced military effectiveness while respecting different national traditions and institutional requirements. The immediate response to Mueller's presentation was thoughtful silence as attendees processed the implications of his assessment. Many had expected criticism of British ceremonial spending, not recommendations for broader adoption of innovative training methods. Air Marshal Pemberton was the first to respond, expressing appreciation for Mueller's objective evaluation and professional integrity. The British officer noted that Mueller's assessment provided valuable external validation of training methods that had evolved through centuries of military experience. The French representative asked about practical implementation challenges that might limit broader adoption of ceremonial training techniques. Mueller acknowledged that resource requirements and cultural adaptation issues would need careful consideration, but argued that the documented benefits justified serious investigation. As the meeting progressed through other agenda items, Mueller found himself reflecting on the broader implications of his London experience. His evaluation had challenged fundamental assumptions about military effectiveness and forced him to reconsider convictions he had held throughout his career. The experience had been professionally humbling but intellectually valuable. Scientific approaches to military effectiveness required willingness to acknowledge when evidence contradicted established assumptions, regardless of personal preferences or institutional convenience. Captain Weber approached his colonel as the meeting concluded, understanding that their working relationship would need to evolve in response to recent events. Mueller's public acknowledgement of being wrong about significant military issues created new dynamics that would require careful navigation. Mueller recognized his aide's concerns and addressed them directly. Professional growth required willingness to learn from experience and modify understanding based on new evidence. His London evaluation had provided valuable insights that would improve his effectiveness as a military leader. The flight back to Germany gave Mueller time to process the full implications of his London experience. He had arrived confident in his understanding of military training priorities and returned with fundamental questions about the relationship between tradition and effectiveness. His formal report would recommend that German military leadership conduct detailed study of ceremonial training methods and their potential applications to Bundeswehr soldier development. The Queen's Guard had demonstrated capabilities that challenged conventional assumptions about military training effectiveness. More personally, Mueller had learned valuable lessons about intellectual humility and the dangers of dismissing unfamiliar practices without thorough evaluation. His professional development had been enhanced by acknowledging that his initial assumptions had been fundamentally wrong. As the plane descended toward German airspace, Muller completed his evaluation notes with a final observation. The Queen's Guard represented sophisticated military training disguised as ceremonial pageantry, producing enhanced soldier capabilities through methods that deserved serious study. Rather than casual dismissal, his big mistake had been assuming that unfamiliar military practices were automatically inferior to conventional training methods. The discipline of the Queen's Guard had taught him that true military effectiveness sometimes developed through unexpected approaches that challenged established assumptions about soldier development.